This is a review of the intersection sight distance, or ISD, from the AASHTO Green Book. For intersection sight distance, we know that drivers must be able to see and observe traffic control devices and, importantly, the conflicting traffic so they can make and take the appropriate action. Some of the common visual impediments that are within the sight triangle, and we'll talk more about sight triangles in this lesson, include the terrain itself, so just the landforms, and it can also take the form of vegetation, trees, bushes, shrubs, other landscaping. It can be parked cars or other roadside objects. At unsignalized intersections, any movements that conflict with a traffic stream that has the legal right-of-way should be examined for appropriate sight distance values. And similarly, at signalized intersections, the specific approaches which allow permitted left turns or right turns during the red interval should be the focus of sight distance evaluations. Another key thing that we're going to look at when we talk about examples and look at information related to the distances and lengths needed for intersection sight distance are that when medians are wide enough to store a vehicle in the middle of their crossing movement or for a left turn, you can allow that movement to be split into two parts. And so if you visualize yourself as a driver, you can do this in two stages. So you may just need to cross one direction of travel at a time, get into the median where you can safely store, and then make that second stage crossing, either completing the left turn or crossing that other direction of travel as well. We also need to make adjustments when there are any deviations from the base or kind of ideal scenarios. That's when the grades exceed plus or minus 3%, or when there's additional lanes. And generally what we'll see is that the base case is assumed to be a 2-lane road. So as you add lanes, if it's a 4-lane road or a 6-lane road, we're going to need to add distance and time gaps for our intersection sight distance for these scenarios. These are our various cases, starting at case A with intersections with no traffic control, and those are fairly uncommon. Case B is stop control. Case C are yield control. Case D is traffic signals. Case E is always stop. Case F are left turns from the major road, and case G are for roundabouts. And as you can imagine, you can see some of the subcategories here. Some of these scenarios have much more information and analysis required to complete than others. So starting here with case A, these are intersections with no traffic control. So these are relying on drivers to observe the conflicting vehicles and stop before entering the intersection. As you may imagine, these are pretty rare, and these are going to be in very, very low volume rural locations typically. The arrival of multiple vehicles at the same time is infrequent because of that, and the result of those low traffic volumes. The length of the approach legs define the intersection sight distance for those uncontrolled intersections, and the sight triangle that's bounded by those approach lengths should be clear of obstructions. And we'll look at those when we start looking at a diagram to see those sight triangles and see the parts of the road, the areas of the roadway environment that need to be clear so drivers can safely make decisions and proceed through intersections. And again, if the grade of the approach exceeds plus or minus 3%, we need to extend the length of the intersection sight distance. So here's our diagram. We're going to see very similar diagrams in multiple of these cases. Of course, the definitions will change and the lengths will change based on the particular scenario. So when we're looking at vehicles approaching from the left, and this is with, again, with no traffic control, the approach legs will vary in other scenario types. We have a vehicle that's at some decision point. So this is our vehicle that we're observing, that we're analyzing. It's approaching this intersection. We need to determine those approach legs, and then everything inside this sight triangle, this needs to be a clear area so that we can safely see any vehicle that we may conflict with as we're approaching that intersection. The approach leg length must include additional lane width and median width, again, if that median is not wide enough to store a vehicle. And for a 2-lane roadway which is shown in this illustration, one additional lane width should be added to the approach leg length. And that's for this AASHTO case over here on the right. So we're looking at vehicles approaching from the right now, and this is our sight triangle from the right, and this is where, in this case, we need to add that extra lane width to take us to the center of that further opposing lane of travel. So this is looking at our lookup table for the length of the approach leg. This is from the Green Book 2018 version, table 9.4. So given our various design speeds, we can determine the length of that approach leg. So pretty simple lookup table here, design speeds and approach legs. If we have grades that exceed 3%, plus or minus, so plus or minus 3%, all those adjustments are 1, so multiplying it by 1 gives us the same value. But if it's 4 or greater on either the negative or the positive side, we need to use the adjustments value from this table. And in some of those instances, we do see that those are still 1. But as the design speed goes up, increases, we're going to have a value that differs more from 1. Next, we have case B. This is our stop control on the minor road. And this applies to vehicles that arrive at a stop controlled approach. They're on the minor road, and the major road is uncontrolled, meaning the major road has the right of way. There's no traffic control device there. So those vehicles are going to be traveling at their operating speed. And there's 3 subcategories here. The left is case B1, turning right is case B2, and going through the intersection is case B3. So we need to identify that we're at a stop control on a minor road, case B, and then the specific movement type that we may be making, left, right, or through, for the vehicle of interest. So looking at our sight triangles now for the stop control on the minor road, this looks different than our uncontrolled intersection because we really have a decision point, because we're assuming that the driver is going to stop at the stop sign. So that decision point is makes up our departure leg, and that departure leg must include an additional half lane width beyond the minimum length of 14.5 feet. That 14.5 feet is from the edge line, the edge of the lane on the major road back to that decision point. And it basically assumes that a pretty conservative value that the driver's position, obviously it's not towards the front of the vehicle. We've got the hood and there's parts of the vehicle in front of us, and also a driver's not going to pull all the way up to the very edge of that travel lane. So that's what's making up that departure leg. And then the leg along the major road is really what we're calculating in our upcoming values and equations. We've got the same type of scenario over on the right sight triangle. We've got our decision point. The departure leg is now longer because it needs to go all the way from the middle of that closest lane if that median width is not wide enough to store a vehicle. And so for a 2-lane roadway like the one shown in this image, you need to add 1.5 additional lane widths for that departure leg. So we've got half of a lane width here, then a full one, and then we're adding on that 14.5 feet from the edge of the travel way. Our equation for the length of that leg along the major roadway is 1.47 times the speed along the major road times our time gap. The important thing here to notice is that 1.47 is a conversion factor. So our design speed of the major road is in miles per hour, and our time gap that we're going to look up on the following slides is in seconds. So it's important that we make that distinction, and we know what those values are, and we put them in speed in miles per hour and the time gap in seconds. Now here are our values. Again, this is for case B1. We see that the base time gap will vary in other scenarios. We've got to make sure that we are choosing the correct case when we're looking at this. Our base time gap varies depending on the type of vehicle. So a passenger car is 7.5 seconds, a single unit truck is 9.5, and a combination truck is 11.5 seconds for our base time gap. We need to adjust that time gap depending on 2 scenarios: if there are extra lanes to cross, or if there's an approach grade that's greater than plus or minus 3%. So for our extra lanes for the passenger car, we're going to add an extra half of a second for each additional lane. And for the single unit truck and combination truck, 0.7 seconds for each additional lane that needs to be crossed. On our approach grade, it's 0.2 seconds for each additional percent beyond plus or minus 3% in grade. Next, we're going to case B2, and we do see that there's an adjustment here or a difference in this base time gap. So our overall equation of 1.47 times the design speed of the major road times your time gap stays the same, but that base time gap changes depending on our scenario. So this is case B2. We've got our same type of design vehicles, different time gaps, and now 0.1 seconds for each additional grade beyond the 3%. And this is for making a right turn. So when you're making a right turn, it doesn't matter how many additional lanes there are on the roadway. Most drivers, and the assumption will be that the driver will accept and turn into that first lane that they encounter. So that's why there's no additional adjustment for additional lanes. And finally, this is case B3. So this is for crossing the major road. Here's our time gap, 6.5, 8.5, and 10.5 seconds for our respective design vehicles. We do need to supplement them, so half a second for each additional lane for the passenger cars, 0.7 for the truck scenarios, and then 0.1 second for each additional percent grade beyond 3%. Now to case C. This is yield control on the minor road. We have the same subcategories that we had for our stop control, now just with a yield sign, so you can go through, left, or right. And we've got a very similar sight triangles. Now we're, instead of just a departure length, we've got the leg along the minor road, the length of that leg along the major for both the left and the right turns. For the right sight triangle, the approach leg length must include the additional lane width and median width, again, if that median is not wide enough to store a vehicle. And for the two-lane roadway, as shown in this illustration, we would need to add one additional lane width to that approach leg length. Same equation. Again, we're going to carry this equation forward, that the length of the leg of the sight triangle along the major road is 1.47 times the design speed of that major road, miles per hour, times the time gap that we'll look up in our various tables for the appropriate scenarios. For our time gap, this is how we're going to calculate it for the vehicle yielding along the minor road to cross the major road, and this is going to be in seconds. So our time gap is equal to our travel time to reach the major road from the decision point. So this is accounting for that a vehicle is going to yield, not stop. So they're still going to be moving. So we'll have to look up the value for T sub A. And then the second component here is W, which is the width of the intersection to be crossed in feet, plus the length of the design vehicle in feet, divided by 0.88 times the design speed of the minor road in miles per hour. Here's our lookup table for that T sub A component. So we need to know our design speed, and then we can look up that length of the leg for the sight triangle leg minor here, and also the travel time to reach the major road T sub A. So we've got both those values here, both the time component T sub A and what that overall length of the leg should be given that design speed and what would be associated with that travel time. Case C2. This is our right turn, so we're approaching the intersection. We're going to yield at this intersection. We have our decision point. We're now given this distance from the inside, from the middle of that closest lane to us of 82 feet, and we need to determine or calculate the length of that leg along the major road. We have our same equation, 1.47 times the design speed of the major road times the time gap. And in this case, we're told that for a passenger car, it's 8 seconds, single unit truck 10, and a combination truck 12 seconds. Now for a left turn from the minor road that is yield controlled, our left sight triangle has a leg along the minor road of 82 feet, and that's measured from the middle of the closest lane. On the right sight triangle, we're going to need to add to that an additional lane width and median width if it's not wide enough. So for this illustration, it'd be an additional lane width added to 82 feet as our assumed minor approach leg length. For the major leg length, it's 1.47 times the design speed of the major road times the time gap. And again, 8, 10, and 12 is going to be our base time gap for passenger car, single unit truck, and combination truck, respectively. And if there are extra lanes, we're going to add 0.5 seconds for each additional lane if we're evaluating a passenger car, and then 0.7 seconds for each additional lane if it's a truck. For traffic signal control, this is vehicles that arrive at a signalized intersection, and the general requirement is that the first vehicle on each approach should be visible to the first vehicle on all other positions. That's a pretty standard arrangement of an intersection, and that allows drivers to be able to see those opposing and potentially conflicting vehicles. There are 3 specific operational conditions that should warrant additional sight distance evaluations. That's if left turns are permissive at the signal. We want to do some evaluation there, and we can apply other techniques within our intersection sight distance process to apply to those left turns to make sure that they can have the appropriate sight distance to safely make that turn. If it's flashing operation, and this is common particularly in more rural locations, can also be in suburban locations as well. May also be in urban places. If the signal will operate in a 2-way flashing mode, so the major road has flashing yellow and the minor road has flashing red, that way the minor road is essentially operating as a stop controlled approach. We need to make sure there's adequate sight distance as defined by case B. So essentially that flashing operation reverts that traffic signal back to a stop controlled operation. And for our right turns, if you're going to allow right turning vehicles during red, then you need to determine the appropriate sight distance for case B2. Make sure that's available for the drivers in those right turn on red scenarios. Case E, this is always stop control. This is also a relatively simple one. This applies to vehicles that arrive at an always stop controlled intersection, meaning there's stop signs at each approach. And the requirement here is that the first vehicle on each approach should be visible to the first vehicle on all other positions. So just that all the vehicles can see each other and determine who has the right of way and who should make the next movement. And only really very unusual intersection alignments create sight distance concerns for always stop controlled intersections. It can happen, but they're very uncommon. But that's the basic requirement, is that all the vehicles, all the drivers need to be able to see the other vehicles. And then case F, this is the left turn from the major road. So this is a vehicle on the major road turning left off of the major road and onto a minor road. And this is particularly important for horizontal curves, crest vertical curves, and where there are medians, that divided highways that may have median obstructions that we need to account for our sight distance. So we've got our same equation for a left turn from a major road, 1.47 times the design speed of the major road times our time gap. And our time gap T sub G for left turn from the major road onto a side street or into a property, 5.5 seconds for passenger cars, 6.5 seconds for single unit trucks, 7.5 seconds for a combination truck, and for the extra lanes to cross, half a second for the passenger car, and then 0.7 for both of the truck scenarios. And this is in excess of 1 lane to cross. So let's take a look at a few examples. So in this first one, we're told that a highway agency predicts that single unit trucks will regularly turn left from a 2-way stop controlled intersection onto a 4-lane undivided highway. The highway design speed is 65 miles per hour, and there are minimal grades. What is the recommended intersection sight distance for this movement? So in particular, again, we're focused on that left turn from a stop-controlled intersection. So a simple drawing will usually help, making sure we understand how many lanes there are, what our speeds are, what our type of vehicle is, and the movement that this vehicle is attempting to make. So case B1 applies to this left turning maneuver. The base time gap is 9.5 seconds for a single unit truck, and each additional lane to be crossed adds 0.7 seconds. This scenario requires one additional lane to be crossed because this assumes that the turning vehicle will enter that nearest lane in the opposing direction. So we don't need to go all the way across the road for that left turn. We're going to accept that nearest lane in that opposite direction. So the time gap is 10.2 seconds. That's our base time gap of 9.5 seconds plus an additional 0.7 seconds for that additional lane. Now we can calculate the length of that leg on the major road, 1.47 times our design speed times our time gap. So that's 1.47 times 65 miles per hour times 10.2 seconds. Gives us a length of 975 feet. Our second example here, we have a single unit truck that's going to turn left from a two-way stop controlled intersection onto a 4-lane divided highway. So now we have a median in this scenario. This median is 40 feet wide, and the highway design speed is 65 miles per hour with minimal grades. We're looking for the recommended intersection sight distance for this movement. So very similar scenario, now we're just adding in the median width here. Again, a drawing can help, and I do encourage you to make a drawing for intersection sight distance problems so you understand all the givens and how this is laid out. This median is 40 feet wide, so the single unit truck, which is about 30 feet long, can fit in the median. And therefore, a two-stage crossing is possible. So for this crossing maneuver, we're actually going to have case B3, that's the first stage, so crossing those first two lanes to reach the median. We're going to have a base time gap of 8.5 seconds, and each additional lane to be crossed adds 0.7 seconds. We don't need to include any additional lanes because the basic assumption is that a vehicle is going to cross two lanes. So for the crossing maneuver, case B3, the time gap is just 8.5 seconds. So we can use our equation to find the length along the major leg for that crossing maneuver, 1.47 times 65 miles per hour times our time gap of 8.5 seconds will give us a length along that major roadway of 812 feet. Now for the left turning maneuver, this is case B1. The base time gap is 9.5 seconds for our single unit truck, and each additional lane to be crossed adds 0.7 seconds. We don't need any extra lanes to be crossed because we're already in the median. We're going to accept that first lane, so our time gap is 9.5 seconds. So calculating what the actual length will be, 1.47 times 65 miles per hour times 9.5 seconds gives us a length of 907 feet. So this is what our diagram would look like. Again, we've got that two-stage crossing. So looking from the left, we need 812 feet to be clear along the length of the major road, 907 on that second stage there. And so anything within those red sight triangles needs to be clear from obstructions.